I'm Meredith Preston McGhie. I'm the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Vanessa Erogbogbo, the Chief of the Sustainable and Inclusive Value Chains section and the head of the She Trades Initiative at the International Trade Center. Vanessa, welcome from Geneva. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Meredith. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for inviting us to participate in this really important discussion.
Well, we're really thrilled to have you sort of walk us through some of the issues around inclusive economies. The Pluralism in the Pandemic portal has been looking at a range of different issues around the pandemic and some of the issues around inequality that have been raised over the last several months. And we've really turned our focus now to specifically looking at questions of inequality, economic inequality, and what an inclusive economic system might look like. And I was wondering, in terms of better understanding the scope of the problem and what we're looking at, if you could maybe start by just painting us a picture of what socioeconomic inequalities have been revealed through the pandemic period, particularly in Asia and Africa and the areas in which you're working.
Sure. So let me start by introducing ITC for those who are watching and don't know ITC. We're a joint technical assistance agency of the United Nations and the World Trade Organization, and our focus is on helping SMEs from developing countries to internationalize. And one of the things that we do, a phrase that we've coined, is what we call good trade. And for us, that means trade that's inclusive, trade that's environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable, that works for people and for the planet. So this is a bit who ITC is. I think, Meredith, I would focus on maybe 5 key areas that we have been looking at ITC. And the first one is the effect of the pandemic on MSMEs. And we see these are micro, small, and medium enterprises. And we see that they've been hardest hit by the pandemic. These are the majority of businesses worldwide. They represent 90% of businesses and more than 50% of employment. And in emerging economies, 40% of national income. So governments realize that SMEs are a linchpin connecting the pandemic with the economic recovery, and many of them are implementing measures to help MSMEs respond to the economic crisis. But what we've seen is that small businesses in richer countries get a high level of support from government than small businesses in poor countries. And the results of our surveys from our SME competitiveness report, which is that you can find on our website that we launched in June, gives us cause for concern because MSMEs are reporting 1 in 5 of them could go out of business within the three months from June. So, you know, we'll have a look into that and see what transpired. The second area of concern for us has been the fact that, you know, many jobs have been lost or are at risk, and these are especially jobs for those who are most vulnerable. So for every SME that closes, for every crop that's not being picked, for every online order that's not being placed, this means job losses and families losing their only income. I wanted to give an example, and this has been in the news this week actually, of the textiles, garments and footwear industry, which employs 40 million workers in Asia, many of them women. I think up to 75% of them are women. The fall in retail sales in the first half of the year left many workers jobless. We saw buyers cancelling orders, even orders that had already been manufactured. And this risks driving these workers out of the workforce into informality, especially women. And this could reverse many years of progress that had been made. Even before the pandemic, though, there was a big gender wage gap for those workers, and those workers were receiving only a very small percentage of the price of the clothing, and that meant that they were living below a living wage. So despite the news this week that some of the big groups like H&M and Inditex, you know, the positive business news and that they're coming back into profit, we really need to focus on improving the quality of jobs of these workers. I think this is coming to stark relief during this pandemic. The third thing is around informal workers and their livelihoods being impacted. So in West Africa, we have some large programming funded by the government of Korea, working in agricultural value chains. And we've seen cooperatives and producers in shea in Guinea facing difficulties due to falling demand. We've seen the cashew sector in Côte d'Ivoire suffering because buyers can't even come and purchase cashew during the cashew buying season. We've seen even in producers who are selling on domestic markets in Gambia suffering because of lockdown measures and cancellation of the local weekly markets. So we see that these types of restrictions and measures are creating shortages. There's been increases in basic needs, and this impacts obviously those who are most vulnerable and who have lower incomes. And we've heard from the World Food Programme that hundreds of millions could be pushed into food insecurity by the end of the year, and that more people could be pushed into extreme poverty by the pandemic. And this would be the first time that we would see a rise in the growth of extreme poverty for the past 20 years or so. So this is the first three things. Fourth is the digital divide. And we know that 3 billion people still lack access to the internet. The digital divide cuts across so many spheres. It cuts across within rich countries. It cuts across rich people and poor people. It cuts across men and women. It cuts across regions. For example, Africa has the largest gender gap in internet access. So this has been a real issue that has been brought to the fore by the pandemic, which has accelerated the transition to the digital economy. Markets have moved online. Life-enhancing services have moved online. Education, health, finance became virtual overnight. I mean, even I'm sure yourselves felt that in Canada. We felt it in Switzerland, overnight, having to completely transform the way in which we work. And whilst perhaps you and I may have felt relief at the cut in the daily commute, 3 billion others have been disconnected from important resources such as information and education. And this is, as a parent, a big concern for me to see children really missing out from education. And I look at family in Africa, where in many countries they're not going back to school until next year. So in some of these countries, many of these children really risk access to support services, to meals. We saw a big campaign in the UK by one of the leading footballers on free meals for school children continuing over the summer, because schools provide such an important source of support for these children. And finally, I would point out the gender inequalities being further exacerbated. Women work in more vulnerable jobs. Women tend to, especially in the countries that we work in, they tend to work in sectors that have been most hit by the crisis, in tourism, in hospitality. And likewise, women-owned firms tend to operate in some of the industries most immediately affected by the crisis. Our surveys for the SME Competitiveness Report showed that 64% of women-led firms declared that their businesses were significantly impacted compared with 52% of male-led firms. So these are the 5 key areas I'd say that we're really focusing our efforts on at ITC, and we're seeing really matter when it comes to addressing some of the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic.
Vanessa, you paint a really bleak picture at the moment, and I know it is really troubling for, as you say, for more than 3 billion people around the world at this moment. And there's a couple of things I'd really love to unpack a bit with you in terms of how we could begin to reimagine the global economy. I mean, you talk about how some of these inequalities around the garment sector, for example, are already baked into the system, even pre-pandemic. This isn't that these systems were equitable and now they're in crisis. These were systems that were inequitable to begin with. I think the second thing that really comes out for me of your 5 points is the social inequality, the lack of a safety net, the lack of access to some of these basic services around the world. I very much share your thoughts on the digital divide. I mean, my children were able to to continue their online learning, and we know, for example, in Canada that the access to the internet among Indigenous populations is considerably lower than others in Canada, and so we were already seeing that gap, of that education gap, widening. And you widen the education gap, you widen the inequality around access to economic opportunities in the future. I mean, everything connects through between them. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you would reimagine first these inequitable economic systems that pre-existed, that are leading to some of these challenges. How should these be reimagined? How can they be built back in a way that starts to build a more equitable economic society that also does recognize that we are still in a globalized economy? You talk about cashew traders not being able to move, or garments, as everyone seems to be working in their pajamas. Nobody's buying fancy clothes anymore, and you see these reductions. That's part of the global impact that workers in Bangladesh or in Cote d'Ivoire will be impacted by. So within that globalized system, how do you start to push back against these systemic inequalities as we start to recover from the pandemic?
I think we've all been working on these issues for a number of years, but we were caught so much by surprise, and the ground has really shifted beneath us. So one thing to highlight is that everything has changed. The starting point being changing consumer demand. So existing value chains are changing, new value chains are being created. For example, that was a bleak picture, but there are new opportunities being created in personal protective equipment, in disinfectant for healthcare settings, in different types of garments, masks, in there's a number of different digital services. There are a number of new value chains being created, and a number of new opportunities being created. So I think in reimagining the future of the economy, there's 3 key things we need to focus on in order to bounce back. And I say that without focusing on these 3 key things, then it's a bit like slaving over a beautiful steak and forgetting to put the salt in it. And the 3 things are, governments are putting forward these assistance programs for SMEs, but we need to ensure that these programs are more transparent, and that the information is actually accessible to these firms, because many of the respondents of our surveys are saying that they actually find it very difficult to access this type of information. And I think this has always been an issue for marginalized groups, but now that it's become an issue for almost everyone, it's an area that I think that governments are going to take a greater focus on, reaching these communities. Secondly, I think for a number of years, various initiatives have been in place focusing on the digital economy. Now we've seen that it's not just for the few, it's not just for the workers, it's not just for the urban. We at ITC have had great difficulty reaching some of the beneficiaries that we work with in rural communities and getting that support to them. So now, you know, supporting universal access to the internet isn't something, it shouldn't be a moonshot, it should be something that's a given. And with that universal access, the right digital skills, the right tools to bridge that divide. Also, a focus on the green economy, a focus on sources of the sources of new jobs that are going to emerge, especially for developing countries. A focus on preparing workers for the jobs of tomorrow. We've been talking about the future of work for a long time, but the future of work arrived before we expected it to arrive, and we need to make sure that we can upskill workers to take on more complex types of work, and we can reskill workers to enter into new types of jobs. I mentioned, you know, value chains changing. A lot of manufacturers are looking at bringing manufacturing back onshore or nearshoring manufacturing. So, you know, jobs are going to move around a bit, and we really need to focus on preparing workers to be able to fulfill those jobs. Some of the, and finally, maybe a focus on better family-friendly policies, including parental leave, investment in skilling the childcare workforce, investment in systems that really reach workers who are not in formal employment, because these are the ones that often tend to get left behind by all the measures that we have been seeking to put in place.
Absolutely. And generally speaking, when those choices have to get made in a family setting or in a community setting, it's often the women who say, okay, so I won't go and do whatever it was that I was doing, either in a small enterprise or somewhere in the informal sector, in order to care for the children, to try and help them with online schooling if they have access, even digitally themselves, or simply to stay home with the children if the schools are closed, as they have been in Kenya and now until next year, and other places around the world. I know I've been in several discussions. I know you spend a lot of time on this question about women's employment in relation to the pandemic and the she session that we're seeing and that we anticipate going forward. And so I wonder, just following on from your last point, if you could talk a little bit about what else specifically can be done to ensure that women are getting back into the workforce. I think that we all felt like some of the gains that had been made over the last 20 years were also really critical for women being seen as equal participants in society. That you educated girls on the same basis that you educated boys, that women had the same rights in society. And as we see this retreat into domestic spaces, does this potentially risk not only their economic activity, but some of these wider questions? And what do you think needs to be done right now to really push back on that? I know it's something we've all noticed. So what do we do now to make sure that we don't see the level of she-cession that we're anticipating?
And you know, this is an issue for all of us. It's not an issue just in Asia or Africa. It's an issue for all of us. So as you may know, ITC has been indeed focusing on women in the economy for a long time. We have an initiative called the She Trades Initiative, which is connecting 3 million women to markets by 2021. And it's really a focus on making sure that women can benefit from their participation in trade, not participate more in trade, but actually benefit from the hard work that they're already doing in trade. I think, I always start with the need to address stereotypes. I know these seem like soft issues, but these are the issues that really are the root of many of the challenges that we face. So we really need to call out gender stereotypes, biases, negative norms, and that impact women's participation, particularly from the leadership level. Not to tolerate any of that, I think, is the first thing, and I really urge all leaders to focus on that and to be vocal, male and female leaders to be vocal about that. The second one is around legal barriers. It's staggering to imagine that in 2020, only 8 out of 190 countries that are included in the World Bank's Women, Business and the Law report score 100% in terms of the way women are treated by the law. So, this is something that can immediately be addressed. And great that Canada is one of those 8 countries, as expected. Then the third one I think that we can look at is we don't have to wait for, governments talk a lot about gender equality, and they actually don't need to wait for anyone else to do something about it. Governments have this huge tool at their disposal, and that huge tool is on their own spend. So they can actually create markets for women entrepreneurs by increasing the public procurement opportunities for marginalized groups such as women and such as SMEs. And this can be done in many ways. We have some really great examples of governments who are successfully doing this. Governments like the government of Chile, which through its Selo Mujer program is now reaching 20,000 women entrepreneurs by, putting out low-value procurement tenders, by pushing their procurement online, by creating more transparency around procurement, by creating a seal that looks for, that is able to certify either women-led businesses or companies that employ a lot of women to access these opportunities. So I think these are a few of the things, but likewise, the private sector also has an important role to play in expanding economic opportunities through increased participation in the supply chains. One thing that has been an even greater challenge during the coronavirus, we know that there's an access to finance gap for women entrepreneurs and for women generally. And it's been made worse during this crisis because women and SMEs haven't been able to make sales. The private sector can support through creating liquidity in the supply chains by advancing payments or making sure that they pay their suppliers on time, by providing guarantees to banks and other supply chain financing options. And likewise, in the same way that I think it's important for governments to create better family-friendly policies, the private sector can also support female workers by creating better policies for all parents to take on flexible working relationships. Support programs for women who are experiencing, we have heard reports that women are experiencing greater gender-based violence during this pandemic, families being locked up. for extended periods. So these are some of the things I think we can do. And finally, as an international community, we need to continue the dialogue, to continue the cooperation, to continue the information sharing. In the trade community, back in 2017, we adopted what we consider a really landmark declaration, the Buenos Aires Declaration on Women in Trade. And that really raised the level of ambition. For the first time, we brought gender into the heart of trade. And since 2017, 127, this is really quite something, WTO members have been cooperating to learn from each other, to share experiences. We've developed a report which will be published soon, you know, highlighting some of the good practices of WTO members and sharing information. So I think now we need to build on that declaration and really accelerate the momentum to ensure the outcomes that we envisaged when we first set out to bring gender to the heart of trade.
And really act on that now.
Exactly.
I wanted to take you back. You mentioned the role of the private sector in supporting women in trade, women's employment at this point, and I think the notion also of making it culturally the norm that family-friendly spaces are what corporate spaces should be around the world is so important in terms of that leadership role. We recently piloted an assessment on pluralism that we're going to be launching globally, the Global Pluralism Index. We piloted it recently in Canada, and one of the findings came back that while the private sector in Canada benefits a great deal from diversity in the workforce, from immigration and so forth, they weren't proactive champions necessarily of some of these inclusive issues. So that while they, on the face of it, were positive about it, they weren't making some of those proactive moves. And I wonder if on the questions of sort of inequality in the workforce and in the economy more generally, what else do you feel that private sector can do as leaders? I mean, they have so much power in determining some of these spaces. What else should they be doing right now as we try to look at inclusive economic models going forward?
Well, for one, I think the private sector should be expanding the scope and footprint of their diversity and inclusiveness programs beyond mature markets. And actually, I'm a bit surprised to hear the results of your survey, because one often thinks of companies in North America as being leaders, North America, the Nordic countries as being leaders on diversity and inclusion measures. And what I would like to see is them expand their footprint. You give an example of a company like UPS. I would highlight the incredible work that this big global firm is doing now, moving out of the North American market, setting up a women exporters program, UPS and the UPS Foundation, really putting funding into building the capacity of women entrepreneurs and enabling them to export. I think often the private sector underestimates the resources that they have at their disposal. So it's not just about the supply chain, and it's not just about funding, it's also about the incredible expertise that these companies have. So a company like UPS or another company that we work closely with, Maersk, they provide a service from their employees who give training and coaching on very specific things like logistics, shipping, warehousing, tariffs, trade regulations, really important and specific knowledge that they are actually the experts at. So This is one area that I think the private sector can do, is really leverage the expertise of their workforce to help lift everyone else up. The second thing I think is around partnerships, especially on the issue of financing the Sustainable Development Goals. We've seen, even before the pandemic, we were lagging on some of the SDGs, and that's why the Secretary General kicked off a decade of action this year to make sure that we could accelerate the progress. And one big issue is that there's a big gap in financing, several $1 trillion gap in financing the SDGs. And on the one hand, investors, there's no shortage of investor capital, but on the other hand, there's a perceived high risk of investing in some of these economies and in some of these companies. We think that by partnering with philanthropy and with governments and with civil society, that there can be some innovative models come through. I always say, we put a man on the moon back, I don't know, 50 years ago. So this isn't really rocket science. We can put our heads together and figure out some innovative models that can make sure that investment flows into you know, these issues, social good. And then finally, I want to touch on the environment and climate change, because, you know, we've seen that, I guess this is the defining issue of our time. I have a 17-year-old daughter who is, you know, constantly talking about these issues, and it's great to see young people really engaged on these issues. I think the private sector really needs to seriously implement the commitments that they've been making over recent months on accelerating climate investments, on accelerating climate action. And this is important because the most vulnerable to the risk of climate change are those in the poorest countries. It's the, you know, the farmers, the herders, the fishers who really depend on natural resources for food and income that are being the hardest hit. So if the three things I would say is, one, leveraging all their resources to lift up everyone, including the expertise of their staff. Two is you know, innovative financing mechanisms, partnering with broad stakeholders. And three is this focus on climate action.
That's wonderfully concrete as well. And I think, as you say, the overlap between those who are most affected by the economic impacts of the pandemic and the pandemic itself, the health impacts, are also those most impacted by climate change in this moment. And so that's really where the focus needs to be. When we consider pluralism as a concept, we see it as something that's very action oriented and positive, that this is positive embracing of all of these diversities and challenges that we have, and finding a way of building something that's stronger and better. And so as we conclude, I was wondering, we like to try and conclude on a hopeful note, and I wanted you to just maybe give us an example of something else that's been really inspiring you during this period. I think sometimes we feel that innovation and creativity does thrive in times of constraint and crisis, and so there are new things that are emerging. And so I wonder if we could maybe conclude with you just reflecting on what's really been inspiring you in this moment.
You know, I think the thing that inspired me just so much is the work that many of our women entrepreneurs have been doing during the pandemic. So many of them have been making sure that they continue to pay their employees even when they're not earning a living. Many of them have been focused on turning their production to services and products that would support their communities. We had an example in the Gambia where tour guides, you know, young people who had been trained to be tour guides, of course, no longer had any business, and went out and used those skills to spread public health information in the rural communities. You know, it's been really inspiring to see how the people, it seems to me like the people with the least have been the ones who have really stepped up to give the most, to mentor, to offer advice, to offer to open their networks. And that for me has been really, really inspiring. So, you know, we've all been in the same storm. We've been in different boats, some in strong boats, some in weak boats, and it's been really inspiring to see how everyone seems to have rallied around to help each other. Because, you know, we think of the economy as this big thing, systemic obstacles is this big thing, but really it's us as individuals who make it turn and who can make the difference. Many of us doing many little things are what can make the big difference in the end.
Absolutely. It's about individual choices and actions. We can all choose to be more inclusive. We can all choose to take action against the inequalities that we see. And I think that's a really, that's a great point to conclude on, to be inspired by those who have the least doing the most to really include and support those around them. Vanessa, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you today, and to all of our viewers in the Pluralism and Pandemic portal. I hope you'll join us again. And there's a number of other resources that we'll be posting specifically around inclusive economies. And we really look forward to continuing this conversation. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Meredith. It's been a pleasure.